Hello, everyone, and welcome to ITMO, which stands for Instant Transformation Moment. And this is when we get together every week at the same time to experience our spiritual intelligence together. And we use a very simple technique called the 3Q method, which instantly connects you to your spiritual intelligence. Well, when I say instantly, it works in a second or less, which is pretty much instant. So before we actually experience our spiritual intelligence together using this method, I want to spend a few minutes on exploring the neuroscience of spiritual intelligence. And to do that, I want to bring in an article I wrote about the neuroscience of spiritual intelligence, which I'm on this now. And it'll make it easier for me to explain this when I can show you the article. So you should be seeing now the article called The Neuroscience of Spiritual Intelligence. So I'm going to read a bit from this article. 3 modes of brain processing. Neurological studies have established that the brain has 3 distinct processing modes called serial, parallel, and synchronous. Serial processing is associated with IQ functions in the left brain. Parallel processing is associated with EQ functions in the right brain. And synchronous processing is associated with SQ functions in the whole brain. Oscillations at 40 Hertz propagate across the whole brain synchronously and are associated with conscious attention and the state of presence. By linking part brain functions from both hemispheres into the integrated field of the whole brain, 40 Hertz synchronous oscillations connect mind, self, and world into a meaningful whole. Consequently, 40 Hertz oscillations constitute the neural basis for spiritual intelligence. Recent findings in neuroscience confirm that spiritual intelligence is hardwired in the human brain, but SQ circuitry remains largely dormant and undeveloped unless the SQ neural network is actually used. Random moments of spiritual intelligence occur spontaneously, but not very often. Therefore, it's important to know how to activate SQ intentionally, thus converting spiritual intelligence from a random, fleeting experience into your most valuable personal resource. So the point of exploring the neuroscience of spiritual intelligence is so it's clear to you that spiritual intelligence is a brain state or corresponds to a brain state that can be scientifically distinguished from other brain states. Now, I want to read you this next paragraph here. Consciousness is not a product of the brain. Recent studies in post-materialist science confirm that consciousness is not a product of the brain, contrary to the materialist point of view that still prevails in mainstream neuroscience. These studies, as summarized below, provide conclusive evidence that consciousness continues in the absence of brain activity. Some of these studies are based on the experience of patients in surgery. In some cases, after recovering from an operation, patients were able to accurately report events that occurred in the operating theatre during the time that their brains were not functioning. In other words, they hooked up a machine which registered brain activity. And during times when there was no electrical activity and no blood flow in the brain, events occurred in the operating theatre which the patients were later able to report accurately. In other words, they were conscious even when their brain was not functioning. And as it says here in the article, evidently, consciousness does not depend on the brain. The brain is the receiver of consciousness, not the source of consciousness. These studies represent scientific evidence for the existence of consciousness independent of the brain, otherwise known as the soul. And then underneath that paragraph, there's a link to an article which goes into the evidence for the independence of consciousness from the brain. So if you want to check this out and see the evidence for yourself, go to this article on the SQ website, The Neuroscience of Spiritual Intelligence. There's a link to this article in the description of this video, above the video. And you'll find the evidence there that I've just referred to. So this is a very important matter, of course, and goes to the heart of what spiritual intelligence is all about. So I hope you found that interesting. To me, it's fascinating that we now have this scientific evidence that consciousness is independent of the brain and does not depend on the brain. So let's now turn to how we experience spiritual intelligence using the 3Q method. Now, I want to show you a few slides about this because it'll help me explain the method more clearly. So what you can see on the screen now is a symbol for 3 dimensions of intelligence: IQ, EQ, and SQ. And this symbol opens out into the twin poles of attention. We have the object pole of attention and the subject pole of attention. And at the object pole are states of body and mind. And at the subject pole is simply awareness itself. So the object pole is the location for everything you're aware of: thoughts, emotions, memories, beliefs, self-image, you name it. Anything you're aware of is at the object pole. And consciousness itself, which is what we are, is our location at the subject pole. And of course, consciousness itself is what is aware of objects of attention. Now, let me just show you another slide which builds on this slide. So this slide here is the same as the last slide, with the exception of these addition of 2 words, ego and soul. So when we identify with objects of attention, for example, when we identify with our thoughts and emotions, that's called being the ego. And when we identify with consciousness itself, that's called being the soul. And so we can see that the ego and the soul are at opposite poles of attention. So this diagram, therefore, represents the human operating system. You're either at one pole of attention as the ego, or you're at the other pole of attention as the soul. The only exception to this is either in deep sleep, when you're at neither pole of attention, or if you're using transcendental consciousness, which is prior to the mechanism of attention altogether. So let's have a look now at how you shift from ego to soul, because that's the key to spiritual intelligence. And ego and soul is this mechanism of attention. So we have to find a way through this mechanism to shift from ego to soul and therefore activate our spiritual intelligence. And it turns out the fastest way through this mechanism from ego to soul is composed of 3 steps. These are the steps: notice, feel, and be. And when you complete those steps in the way I'm about to describe, you shift from ego to soul, from false self to true self, which then activates your spiritual intelligence. So let's now describe these 3 steps. These 3 steps are called the 3Q method. So step 1 is notice, and that just simply means to notice that your attention does have 2 poles. There's what you're aware of at one pole of attention, and awareness itself at the other pole of attention. So it's simply to remind ourselves of that, because we so often forget, don't we? We so often get bound up with objects of attention that we forget I'm the one aware of objects of attention. I'm not my thoughts and emotions. I am the one aware of my thoughts and emotions. So this is step 1, reminding ourselves of this fact. Step 2 is feel. And this is where we get to feel what it's like at the subject pole as awareness itself. So let's now do this step 2. Now to do step 2, we use a breathing technique. So bring your attention to your breathing now. Just notice at the end of the in-breath, there's a slight pause when you're neither breathing in or breathing out. Just find that pause now. Now, you don't have to hold your breath. In fact, it's important not to hold your breath. Just breathe normally, in and out, and notice there's a split second at the end of the in-breath when you're neither breathing in or breathing out. Did you find that short pause at the end of the in-breath? So when you find that short pause in the breathing at the end of the in-breath, notice what happens to your thinking mind in that pause. Did you notice what happens to the thinking in that pause? Check it out. The thinking pauses as well, doesn't it? When the breathing pauses, the thinking pauses. It's fascinating, isn't it? Now, when you've found that, check out how you feel in that pause. How do you feel in that pause at the end of the in-breath when you're neither breathing in or breathing out, and when the thinking pauses? How does it feel? How does it feel for you? So each time you come to the end of the in-breath, notice that there's a slight pause in the breathing and that your thinking pauses, and notice how it feels in that pause. feels peaceful, doesn't it? Just check it out again for yourself. How does it feel in that pause? Did you feel that peaceful feeling there? So when you found that peaceful feeling, we're going to move to step 3, which is be. So as you breathe in and you find that still point at the end of the in-breath, feel that peaceful feeling there. And now move to step 3, be. Be that peaceful feeling. And that simply means allow the peaceful feeling to go all over your body and mind. So take a look around now. Just notice that you're now being consciousness itself. You're being the field of consciousness. Anything you're aware of is an object in the field. But now you're feeling the qualities of consciousness itself. You're not feeling the qualities of the objects in the field of consciousness. And you'll discover that the qualities of consciousness itself are not only peacefulness, but compassion and joy and love and creativity and integrity. All these qualities spontaneously emerge when you're simply being consciousness itself. So this is how we activate spiritual intelligence, using these 3 steps: notice, feel, and be. So this is a very simple technique called the 3Q method. And you'll find a video about this method in the description of this video above it, if you want to go into more detail about how to use this technique. So I hope you'll experiment with this during the day, this technique, notice, feel, and be, and prove to yourself that it actually works. And it actually works in any circumstances. You can use this technique while you're walking down the street, while you're talking to people, while you're at work, in any circumstances. And it works so rapidly that it does not interfere with anything you're doing. It's completely compatible with everything you're doing. So this is an extremely useful technique, and I hope you'll prove it to yourself by using it during the day when you remember to. Now, of course, we're doing this together every week at the same time, Wednesdays at 12 noon, London time. And we're doing it for our own sake, of course, so we can develop this capability for spiritual intelligence. But we're also doing it to contribute to collective consciousness. Now you might ask, well, how does that work? How do we contribute to collective consciousness by experiencing our own spiritual intelligence? Well, the thing is that when we as a group activate this higher dimension of intelligence, we're actually influencing collective consciousness, collective human consciousness, and we're making it easier for other people to experience their own spiritual intelligence by establishing this pathway in collective consciousness from ego to soul. collective consciousness has been proven to be a reservoir that we can all access. There's a story called The 100th Monkey, which illustrates this very well. You may have heard the story. Some scientists were investigating the activity of a group of monkeys on an island in the Pacific. This was in the 1950s. And they noticed that this group of monkeys began to wash their food in the sea before eating it, which was a new behavior that had never been observed before in any other group of monkeys. And they were washing the sand off their food in the sea. And as soon as it got to 100 monkeys doing this, they discovered that monkeys on other islands began doing the same thing when they'd never done it before. So this is called the 100th monkey phenomenon, when a group of monkeys in one location develops a new behavior, which is then taken up by groups of monkeys on other islands when there was no means of communication between the first group and these other groups. And it was then understood that this new behavior had been taken up by the collective consciousness of monkeys. And so just as monkeys have a collective consciousness, so do we as humans. So when we contribute to collective consciousness by installing a new pathway in consciousness, then the whole of humanity can access this new element in collective consciousness. And that's why when we practice spiritual intelligence together using the 3Q method, we make it possible for other human beings to more easily experience their spiritual intelligence, because every human being has access to collective human consciousness. So you see, the more we practice together as a group, the more we can contribute to global transformation. So I hope you'll join us next week at the same time, Wednesdays, 12 noon, London time, when we practice spiritual intelligence together. So I'll say goodbye for now and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye for now.